The first thing I always ask producers if I get a question on some forages is, have we done the feed analysis? To me, that's one of the cheapest and easiest things you can do so we can make a better and more accurate and cost-effective ration for those cows during the wintertime. And, we're talking some labs, $20 to just get a general feed analysis for that hay. And, as you kind of mentioned, between the North or even just different regions in the U.S., alfalfa quality is different. We feed a lot of small grain hay, and just making sure we get that accurate analysis conducted to get us a good picture of what's going on in those cows.
Welcome to the Feed Science Podcast, brought to you by Wisenetics. I'm Carlos Campabadal from Kansas State University, dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the feed science from the feed science industry. Please get ready to expand your knowledge and stay ahead with today's episode. So today, with great pleasure, we have our guest, Dr. Megan Van Emon from the University of Montana State University. Megan, it's a pleasure having you here in the Feed Science Podcast, and I know we have a lot of ground to cover, but first, why don't we just start please tell us a little bit for our both domestic and international audience to know who you are and what you do there at Montana State.
All right. Well, thanks, Carlos. It's great being on today. So I'm from Montana State University, beef cattle extension specialist there, but I'm located off campus in Miles City, Montana. So primarily, as very similar to probably your position, travel around the state, helping producers, extension agents, anything related to beef cattle management, which includes obviously feeds and feeding those, as well as forage and things like that. And I am just going to give a little shout out, Montana State University, go Cats go. We just won the FCS championship with what's been called the best college playoff game in history on Monday night. So, awesome. Yeah.
Well, I know, pretty very timely here and where we are right now on the winter with the new college playoffs system that we have Division 1, 2, and 3, and so on. So great having you here. Montana State University. Of course, if we go now in the media, Hollywood, Montana is always now a big thing, of course, being cattle. And you probably have heard this a lot, and people romanticize that about a ranch over there. And I'm pretty sure it's very cool there with all the mountains and stuff like that. But there is some important there on your work on the extension. And as I know from your research work to help the ranchers there, it's a tough job being a rancher, especially, when I think about Montana, I think about snow. And, in Kansas, we do have, but not as much. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about your research work, what you do in the extension? Then we could dive in a couple of technical topics for our audience.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, we get a lot of snow. I should knock on wood. We've had a very mild winter so far. Zero snow on the ground. It was 45 degrees yesterday and raining. Don't like that just, because of the ice factor, but, I know it'll change at some point. So a lot of the research that I've been involved in, focuses on, what feeds to utilize during the winter feeding supplementation time frame for that late gestation cow. When is that good timing? Also, then we feed a lot of small grain hay up here, which includes a lot of nitrate risk. And so my most recent projects have been focusing more on the nitrate aspect and how can we help those animals either adapt to higher nitrate levels because that's, the forage they have available, or, if we can't, then, what are some other management options?
Great. No, that sounds a great topic. So we could dive in. And of course, for our audience, please like us, give us the famous thumbs up here. And I'm pretty sure this episode is very interesting for a lot of us that are come from I come actually even from a beef cattle family business. So let's start. Let's talk a little bit more about that winter feeding and forage quality a little bit. What will be the things that you might want to consider? And for our audience, please keep in mind that we're talking about conditions up here in the northern part of the United States, and but let's learn a little bit more because we have a lot of people, both domestic and international, will be very interested in knowing.
Yeah, the first thing I always ask producers if I get a question on some forages is, have we done the feed analysis? To me, that's one of the cheapest and easiest things you can do so we can make a better and more accurate and cost-effective ration for those cows during the wintertime. And, we're talking some labs, $20 to just get a general feed analysis for that hay. And as you kind of mentioned, between the north or even just different regions in the US, alfalfa quality is different. We feed a lot of small grain hay, and just making sure we get that accurate analysis conducted to get us a good picture of what's going on in those cows.
Perfect, perfect. And I'm just curious, being a grain guy, on the small grains there, and I know Montana's a big wheat state there too. But what other grains there that you guys are using there for as part of the feeding?
So yeah, we do use some wheat, barley, as well as peas have kind of become a bigger portion of it here the last few years, as well as then on the east side of our state here, kind of not quite to the central part of the state. We've started getting more soybeans as well. And so there's a lot of producers looking to feed some soybean, whether it's the hay or the straw. But if our weather during the summer has been pretty different, I guess, who knows what average is anymore. So we've had some crops that have been, hailed out and things like that. So what can we do for some of those forages, and can we safely feed some of those things that may be still in the field, or harvest those for a hay source like soybeans, peas, even some lentils? We've had some feeding there going on just because of the hail we've received or drought or things like that.
So I'm pretty sure that for you guys, for like somebody like you on the nutrition side and production, moving from small grains going to pulses and then of course oil seeds, there's a formulation and adjustment that you guys have to do. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that specifically there? How do you guys challenge that? I mean, how you work with that challenge?
Yeah. So a lot of times what I discuss with, what stage of maturity are those plants at when we're making these decisions? Is there going to be a grain portion that could be significant in that diet? If we get to that maturity and those, plants have already set that seed head and that's going to be available to those cows, that can add a significant portion of energy as well as some protein into the diet. And therefore, maybe we can work on some different management scenarios where, okay, if we can provide enough energy and protein from the grain source that's within that forage, are we needing to supplement some sort of other high quality forage, or can we get away with supplementing a lower quality forage with it, and still meet all her requirements as she needs this time of year?
Perfect. And of course, for our audience, if you have any questions, please leave it there on the comment section, and we'll be sure to send it to Dr. Emon to answer then appropriately. So you talk about there a little bit, you touch base about, the differences if the grain has been there and the maturity of the forages, and if you could feed depending on higher quality, lower quality. So let's dive in a little bit there on how that forage quality should look like. And I know there's depending on the stage, like you mentioned, but let's talk a little bit more from the technical perspective of what do you look into that type of quality factors?
Yeah, so primarily for beef cattle, what I'm looking at, if you have an analysis, otherwise, as you're aware too, we can use some book values and things like that, but I really like to get an analysis done, just keeping that so we're very accurate in our assessment. But what I'm looking at is crude protein as well as total digestible nutrients, or TDN. You'll see it on some of your analyses. Those are kind of the two primary factors for the beef cattle industry. And, this time of year, a late gestation cow, we're probably needing to feed to meet her requirements at maintenance for that fetal growth and everything around a 9% protein diet, or about 2 pounds of protein, and about 14.5 pounds of total energy, or probably in that 52% TDN range is kind of where I kind of start looking at.
And I'm a little bit curious, going back to weather, where we talked a little bit at the beginning of the conversation. I'm assuming, and I'm not a nutritionist, but as you hit the winter months there, and late fall, winter, early spring, that where we're right now, winter. Do you guys adjust there a little bit on the higher energy levels to maintain a little bit more? And how does that look compared to, let's say, a summer? And this is just pretty guessing that summer, maybe depending where you're in the state of Montana, might be dry, some might be a little bit more wet. I don't know. But how does that goes from your perspective in a big state where you have to be helping ranchers with multiple weather scenarios?
That can be a challenge. Yeah, when we get the cold weather, we used to say the kind of the old rule of thumb was for every degree below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you would increase their energy requirements by 1%.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
And that was established back in the 70s and 80s and everything. And I think it's still a good rule of thumb. But we have to consider things like, well, have the cows been able to adapt to the colder weather? Have they been able to establish that hair coat? Do they have a place to get out of the wind? Like up here, I was just, if we're talking like late December, kind of fortunately, maybe I wasn't here at the time because it was over the holidays, but, we clocked 114-mile-an-hour wind here in Miles City. So it's like, but it wasn't that cold. But, how do you overcome some of those additional requirements because of the wind factor? Because there's only so much we can feed them every day during the winter season, because they're developing that calf inside, and so they're starting to limit some rumen capacity there. So I always get a question, well, should I feed high quality? Should I feed low quality? And it's kind of a mix of both, in my opinion.
Okay.
When we get those extremely cold days, and we're talking 20 to 30 below Fahrenheit, in some of the plains areas, and hopefully it's not, long standing. Hopefully we get a week and then it's 50 degrees again. But, what I typically recommend is during those really, really cold days, feed some lower quality forage because it's going to sit in that rumen longer. It's going to be able to ferment longer. And that rumen's their whole heat source during the winter time. And so if we can keep that rumen, warmer for longer, they're able to weather those storms a little bit better than what I would say, like feeding like a nice high quality thing, which would make sense in the terms of meeting requirements during those really cold days as requirements increase. But usually they're more digestible. They ferment a lot faster. They go through it a lot faster. It doesn't have that opportunity to sit in that rumen. And so on those really cold days, I focus more on, okay, what's some lower quality forage that we could feed? And then once we get into some more manageable temperatures, can we feed, then we can bump it back up and feed that better quality forage and kind of get them back on track with requirements and everything. And that all too depends on the body condition of the cow as well. You get really good body conditioned cows, those body condition scores. For us, it's a score of 1 to 9, in that six-ish range, a good fleshier cow. She's going to be able to also weather those storms. Her requirements aren't going to be quite as high as maybe some of those that are in a lower body condition, which, sometimes cows just are, and we have to manage those accordingly.
Wow, but very interesting. And first for our audience, when you say minus 20 degrees to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 20 somewhere around minus 25 Celsius. Once you hit the minus 30 Fahrenheit, it will be closer to minus 30, 32 Celsius. So you can imagine how cold it is, very unmanageable unless you're like really up north in latitude in terms of temperatures. And the wind doesn't help. 140 miles an hour. Wow. You start thinking that is close pretty high on that. And I live in Kansas, so I get a little bit of that feeling, but we don't get temperatures that cold, that constant. So, but the change of temperature, going back to your mention, it is interesting how it goes. Here yesterday we also had temperature that reached 60, for example, which is unheard at this time of the year. Earlier we had minus 10 Fahrenheit, and then the next minus 18 was actually what the with the wind chill that it got in, and then we got the next day 40. It just goes, and that plays a tone in many things. So interesting that people, our audience, can get a little bit of that. So when you're talking about going back to the topic, you were mentioning a little bit lower quality, higher quality forages, things like that. And so a couple of things pop up in my mind, and we all know there's different breeds that are more resistant to heat and cold. But being curious, for the ones that you have there in Montana, which ones adjust better? What would you recommend with all those extreme temperatures and changes that for a producer or a rancher that might be startup, or say, hey, what can I do better?
Oh, that's the $1 million question, right?
I know.
What cow's the best, and everything. Just maybe not to be breed specific, but but kinda. Montana was historically a Hereford state, and we, as I think as genetics progressed and things like that. I mean, a lot of producers are now we still have Herefords in the state, really good Herefords that have adapted to the cold. We also have excellent Angus breeders and things like that. I think a lot of breeds of the continental breeds, they can adapt fairly well to the cold. What would I want if we think about like our typical southern breeds, like a Nellore or like a Brahma or something like that, or that are historically southern breeds and could adapt to those southern climates. I don't know that I'd want them up here trying to make it in the cold. They tend to have thinner skin and hides and everything. So, sticking with some of those breeds that I guess I would say are more mainstream, your Angus, your Herefords, Charolais are fairly common and very well adapt to the cold up here as well. I don't know that there's I would say an ideal breed. Is just more like if for a new producer, what I would look at is, getting animals that have historically been in Montana or in a colder climate, because genetically they are probably, used to being in this colder climate. Yeah, animals adapt to their environment fairly readily over a period of time, and so getting those animals that from ranches or at the sale barn from ranches, or however you're going to do it, from those that have historically been in those northern climates, are probably going to be the most adaptable to your new ranch for the future.
No, that's great, and it's funny in a way because you mentioned Nellore and Brahman, and that's the ones that I grew up in Costa Rica, and so Brangus too here and there, but it's a little bit harder for them, so being tropical weather, but very interesting. And of course for our audience, please share this video if you learned something new today. Going back to the conversation, on an overall nutrition, and we talk about high, lower quality forages. Any other type of feeds, anything other type that you could recommend, or that can be considered for nutrition overall that you would suggest specifically?
Every year I get a lot of questions about grain sources, or they have an opportunity to purchase some grain that might be a little more cost effective than maybe going with a hay or something, just kind of depends. And so I do get a lot of questions about corn grain, and supplementing that in the wintertime to give those cows a little bit of a boost to energy.
Okay.
Out there, and that's an excellent source of grain as well. Just given that little bit of boost and energy can, especially if you have maybe some thinner cows, give them that little bit of boost to grain. Not necessarily, doesn't always have to be corn. That's just the kind of the most common, but you can look at a wheat and a barley and things that are easily or more readily accessible here in the Northern Plains. Those are kind of the top three that I get a lot of questions about. And then don't be afraid to go talk to your local elevator or wherever you're sourcing your feeds from, because sometimes they might have other products in that they could get readily available too, like a wheat mid product, byproduct of the wheat industry, which is fairly common here. Soy hulls have become kind of more common just with our growing soybean industry. And then even, I was dealing with, I can't remember where it was from last week about screenings, grain screenings from the elevator, which can be really variable in content and really hard to assess that why. With an analysis even, because you can grab a handful kind of around and think you get a good representative sample, and then you start feeding and it completely changes. So that's the challenge with screenings, but they're usually, they're cheap. And they're usually good fiber energy source and even sometimes protein for those cows. So, use what's available to you. I think that's the big one is what's available in your area and how can we create a ration or some sort of formulation around it.
No, that's great recommendation, and I appreciate that a lot. Sometimes people just look on what is the common thing that people do everywhere, and I come from a more monogastric feed production, right? It's like, corn and beans, but you go somewhere else and it's like, hey, we use canola. Hey, we use grain sorghum and things like that. And it's very important to adapt at the end of the day. So, which brings sometimes a challenge when you make feed pellets and things like that. But it's adaptable. So, and how about DDGs? Is there a little bit there in Montana? I mean, a little bit some ethanol plants here and there or nearby.
Yeah, as far as I know, we don't have a plant here in Montana, but I know some producers on the east side of the state. They can get them out of North Dakota.
Yeah.
I don't want to say like always, but pretty readily available there out of the west side of North Dakota. And I do have producers that call and ask about feeding some distillers grains. For a while, there was a company making some distillers grains, what we call cake or the 3/4 pellets. And from what I gathered, the cows really liked it. I'm not sure that company is still doing that. So there is some possibility there. I think a lot of times it just depends on the price of corn, obviously, which is, pretty cheap right now compared to what it was here, probably 6, 7, well, even 4 or 5 years ago. But if they can get the distillers grains railed in to a local elevator to get dispersed. And I have producers that kind of work together too to say, hey, if you want to go in on a load together or on a truckload or something, and that can make it more cost effective as well.
Absolutely,
splitting that. So I think I wouldn't say they're commonly used, but I think it is an opportunity for at least those that are closer to those ethanol plants here on the west side of North Dakota.
Great. Great information. And I'm pretty sure our audience can absorb all this and adapt it to their conditions, if either they're producers or academics or anybody in the industry there. So very, very important all this. Any particular, and when we talk a little bit about the quality of the forages, on the protein and total digestible nutrients, any particular thing that you might want to think on quality specs, particle size, or humidity that maybe could be a good recommendation for our audience or your producers per se too?
Yeah, I would say the common method of feeding for a lot of forage here in Montana is, large round bales. We're getting some more large squares in, but a lot of producers don't have the equipment for that. They have the bale beds for the large rounds, and they're able just to roll it out and for those cows, and off they go. And some producers do have some chopper wagons that are, would allow them to feed some more chopped hay. And I think if you're considering something like that, the chopped hay does give you an opportunity to kind of create a forage mix in there, where we could create a good ration there. But I understand too, that's an additional labor cost, or you got to get a guy in to grind the hay down, or if you don't have the chopper wagon yourself or anything. So there's some things to consider there, but primarily it's long stem forage here, and they're just rolling it out off those bale beds, which is, it reduces labor. Yeah, you've got some fuel cost in there. But I think also when you feed things, whether it's a bale bed or the wagon or whatever you're doing, I think the big thing is it gives you an opportunity to look at those cows, make sure everybody's coming up to eat, they're getting what they need, and providing that forage to them and making sure all those cows have an availability to consume what they need to. And that goes the same even if you're feeding like a cake or a grain or something like that, and you're trying to, we don't have a lot of bunk space out in pasture here. And so you're feeding a lot of this on the ground. And so the grain can be a challenge that way, right? Especially if we get some snow and things like that. So, for some producers, it works where they can roll out a bale. And then if you're going to supplement some grain or some cake, just roll it out, just throw it out on top of it if you can. Have somebody come right along behind you and then they'll get some forage in there plus some grain and everything. And it kind of helps minimize some of the waste in that as well.
Great. No, this is great information for technical and then also curiosity and how production. And I'm always into that because I think it's a lot of people don't see how things are done in different parts of the world and even here in the United States and on what we have in different conditions. So
it's time for our famous three.
Feed formulation software is stuck in the past. Most tools haven't evolved beyond basic least cost optimization. A Diet Forage changes that. It's an AI-powered platform with nonlinear ingredient modeling for enzymes and additives, cost per gain and maximum profit optimization, and real-time collaboration like Google Docs for nutrition. Every recommendation is grounded in world-class research, built for modern nutritionists who need more than legacy desktop software can deliver. Work seamlessly with your team and optimize the way modern operations demand. Try dietforage.ai free today. Feed formulation, finally modernized.
We're coming a little bit to our end of our podcast, but before we leave, as part of the traditions that we do here in this Street Science podcast is we always like hear recommendations from our guests in terms of somebody, for example, wants to learn a little bit more about forages that you can use for beef cattle, learn about production and nutrition, and just be better, technically speaking. So what would be that resource or a book or something that somebody who's not an expert can look into it and say, okay, this is what I need to go look. It could be websites, whatever information you want to do. And you're an extension, so you kind of probably do that quite often.
Yeah, we've created, I'm one of two beef specialists, and we've created some handouts, obviously, on our MSU Beef Extension website, things like that. But one of the resources I kind of readily use, there's a couple beef cattle handbooks out there, and it not only covers kind of the beef animal, but also some forage and feeds and that kind of information is, there's one out of Oklahoma State, and then there's an University of Idaho beef cattle handbooks that I really like to use because I think they're very producer friendly. It's not all technical terms and things like that. It's more easily, I guess, readable.
Mm-hmm.
And relatable to the producer as well.
And then, we talk about that on the technical side, but, and I think you also mentioned or I read that you also teach and, do some work there with students. But if you're trying, to recommend a book outside of your field of expertise or a resource, anybody that could help grow their career so they could be better, what will you recommend or something that you follow through specifically?
Yeah, a book I read, it's been a few years ago now, but I've been trying to incorporate it into, I guess, just my life in general, and it's called Extreme Ownership, and it's Leif Babin and, I forget, Jocko Walnick or something like that, I think. I follow them on LinkedIn and everything, and they always just have really good information on, accepting extreme ownership of the decisions you make, as well as some of the, whether you've been challenged with some different information and things like that. And I think it's helped me kind of help my graduate student management and things like that, where I just think it's a really good read. I'm not much of a nonfiction reader, but I really enjoyed that book, just based on their military stories and how they were able to basically further their military careers and become higher ranked and things like that, and accepting that ownership of all of their decisions and things like that.
No, that's great recommendation, and I always like it. I even wrote it down because I think it's always good to hear what other people are looking and using for guidance, and very important. So, just one last question: in your opinion, what would set successful professionals in our industry of animal production nutrition apart from those who are not successful? What would you recommend somebody besides a book and things like that, but to look? What will set them apart?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try and practice, we always kind of get stuck in that's the way we've always done it. But being open to new ideas, whether it's what you think would work or not, because, a lot of producers throughout the whole United States, internationally, they've been doing this for years. And they've adapted to their own situations and their managements. And I think listening, and not listening to respond, but just listening to take that information in. And a lot of times I can go, oh, geez, that's something I can use. I got this question a couple weeks ago from a producer, and this producer had that idea. Well, now I can say, well, I've heard of somebody using it, and it's worked well for them. So listening and trying to take in those new ideas or different ideas on how management is done, whether it's beef cattle, farming, ranching, however it is, and trying to help promote that and, just learn new ideas.
Perfect. No, this is great advice, and we really appreciate. So with that, Dr. Van Emon, thank you very much for joining us today in the Feed Science Podcast. And for our audience, this concludes another episode of the Feed Science Podcast brought to you by Wisenetics. Thank you for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay updated for future episodes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback is very valuable for us. And until next time, this is Carlos Campabadal from the Feed Science Podcast signing off. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.